I should have noticed the warning signs, but grief has a way of blinding you. The day after burying my husband, my daughter Julia arrived with her husband, both dressed in black as if mourning. But when Julia smiled, it wasn't sympathy, it was victory. She placed a folder in front of me. "Dad left it all to me, Mom. You'll get $200. Enough to find somewhere small." My hands trembled as I opened it. $200 for a lifetime of marriage, sacrifice, and love. My home, my security, my memories, all gone with one cruel lie. That's when I understood. I hadn't just buried my husband. I had buried my daughter too. I'm Eleanor Hayes, 67 years old, and until a few months ago, I thought I had built a good life. My husband, Thomas, and I were married for 43 years. He was my anchor, my confidant, the kind of man who noticed when my favorite mug chipped and quietly replaced it before I even asked. He wasn't perfect, no one is, but he was steady, and his steadiness became the foundation of our family. When we married, we had nothing but a second-hand couch and 2 stubborn dreams. He worked long hours, crunching numbers for small businesses, and I raised our daughter, Julia. Money was tight, but Thomas had a sharp mind for investments. Over time, his firm grew, our savings thickened, and the life we once only whispered about in bed at night slowly came true. A house with a wide porch, vacations to the coast, a college fund for Julia. It was modest by some standards, but for us, it was everything. And Julia, our one and only child. She came into this world wailing so fiercely the nurses joked she had the lungs of an opera singer. I adored her. Thomas did too, though he was stricter with her than I ever was. I wanted her life to be easier than mine had been. So I gave her everything I could: ballet classes, summer camps, a car the day she turned 16. Every scraped knee, every heartbreak, I was there with open arms. Maybe I coddled her too much. Maybe I mistook indulgence for love. But she was my baby, my miracle. As the years passed, I began to notice the shadows in her character. Her temper when things didn't go her way, her envy of friends who had more, her habit of twisting stories until she looked like the victim. I told myself it was just youth, that she'd grow out of it. Mothers see what they want to see. Thomas, though, he saw it clearly. He used to warn me, "Ellie, you've got to stop bailing her out. Someday, she's going to believe the world owes her everything." I would laugh it off, brushing away his concern. "She'll be fine," I'd insist. "She's just spoiled now. She'll grow up." But she never did. When Thomas's heart began to weaken, Julia didn't visit much. She always had an excuse: a demanding job, a vacation she couldn't reschedule, some new urgent matter that pulled her away. I sat by his hospital bed alone most nights, holding his frail hand, whispering to him about the garden he'd planted, the one he swore he'd tend again come spring. He didn't make it to spring. Losing him was like losing gravity. The house we'd shared became unbearable in its silence. His chair at the kitchen table, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the nightstand, it all felt frozen, as though time itself refused to move without him. I thought grief would be my greatest battle. But I was wrong. Just days after the funeral, Julia and her husband, Mark, arrived. They were dressed in black still, as though to mask their intentions with a costume of mourning. But there was no sorrow in their eyes. Julia's lips curved into a smile too smooth, too deliberate. Mark carried himself like a man on a mission. "We need to go over Dad's wishes," Mark said, dropping a thick folder of papers onto the kitchen table. Julia slid them toward me with rehearsed gentleness. "Mom, it's all here. Dad wanted me to inherit everything. He wanted you to have a little money to get settled somewhere smaller, something easier to manage." I opened the folder with trembling fingers. A legal document, supposedly Thomas's will. According to it, Julia inherited the house, the accounts, everything. My portion? $200. 200. Enough to buy groceries for a week, not a lifetime. It was absurd. Impossible. Thomas would never have done this to me. This was the man who left love notes tucked into my recipe books, who promised I would never want for anything. But my grief had dulled my instincts. My body was too heavy with sorrow to argue, too stunned to fight. So I let them take it. I stood in the bedroom Thomas and I had shared, staring at the walls we had painted together, the photographs we had hung. Julia and Mark moved through the house like conquerors, pointing, planning, measuring. And I, the widow, packed my life into a single suitcase. My home, my memories, my history, all stolen by my own child. That night, I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The wallpaper peeled, the bed sagged, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the suitcase by the door. My entire life reduced to a handful of belongings. My heart throbbed with grief, but another feeling stirred beneath it. A seed of suspicion. Thomas would never have left me like this. Not by choice. Something was wrong. As the clock ticked past midnight, I whispered into the empty room, "Why, Thomas? Why would you do this to me?" But in my heart, I already knew he hadn't, and that realization sparked something stronger than sorrow. It sparked resolve. This wasn't just about losing my husband anymore. This was about losing everything, and the gnawing sense that my daughter had placed the knife squarely in my back. And if she thought I was too broken to fight, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The truth revealed itself slowly, like rot under fresh paint. The morning after Julia and Mark forced me out, I awoke in the motel to the rattle of an old air conditioner. Sleep had been impossible. My head swirled with questions. Why would Thomas abandon me? Why had Julia treated me like a stranger? Nothing about it fit. I decided to call Richard Evans, Thomas's lawyer and friend of nearly 30 years. Richard had always been discreet, loyal, and unshakably professional. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. "Eleanor," he said over the phone, his voice taut with concern. "That doesn't sound right at all. Thomas and I went over his will countless times. Please come to my office immediately." Within hours, I was sitting across from him in his downtown suite, the scent of polished wood and leather thick in the air. Richard slid a file across the desk with hands that trembled ever so slightly. "This," he said, "is the real copy of Thomas's will." I opened it with shaking fingers. My eyes darted across the pages, and then the words struck like a hammer blow. Thomas had left me everything. The house, the investments, the accounts. Over $23 million. Julia was to receive $10 million, more than enough to secure her future, but far less than what she had claimed. And then I saw it. A clause written in Thomas's careful, deliberate hand. If Julia Hayes, daughter of Thomas and Eleanor Hayes, mistreats, neglects, or attempts to deceive her mother following Thomas's passing, her entire inheritance shall revert to Eleanor Hayes. My breath caught. My blood went cold. Julia hadn't just misled me, she had lied outright. She and Mark had shoved a false version of the will into my hands, stripped me of my dignity, and cast me out of my own home while the ink on Thomas's grave marker was barely dry. I sank back in my chair, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. Why would she do this? I whispered. Richard's expression hardened. "I've suspected for a long time that Mark has been influencing her. He's reckless, Eleanor. He's been drowning in debt for years. Julia probably saw your grief as the perfect opening." The bile rose in my throat. My daughter, my only child, had chosen greed over love. But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's something else you need to understand. Thomas wasn't just wealthy. He was careful. Very careful. Over the years, he worked with federal investigators. He cleaned up questionable investments through cooperation deals. His fortune isn't dirty, but it's been scrutinized more than once. He wanted to make sure you were protected. That's why the clause is so strict. He knew Julia's weaknesses. It felt as though Thomas was still watching over me, even from the grave. He had known. He had tried to shield me. Julia thought she had staged the perfect theft. But in reality, she had handed me the perfect weapon. That evening, I carried the true will back to Emily's house, my closest friend since childhood, the woman who had opened her spare bedroom to me without hesitation. Emily greeted me at the door, her eyes soft with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. "In a way, I have," I murmured, clutching the folder to my chest. "It was Julia. She lied. She and Mark, they tried to erase me." Emily's face tightened with fury. "That girl. I always said she was too entitled for her own good. But this." She shook her head. "This is monstrous." Later that night, I sat alone in the guest room, staring at the folder on the desk. My tears came hot and heavy, soaking the sheets. I thought of the nights I stayed up when Julia was sick, the birthdays I planned, the sacrifices Thomas and I made so she could have everything. And she had repaid me with cruelty. She had stood at her father's grave, not with grief, but with greed. When the sobs finally subsided, a stillness settled over me. I wiped my face, inhaled deeply, and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the broken widow from a week ago. She was something else, someone forged in fire. Resolve. Julia had underestimated me. She thought I was too frail, too heartbroken, too dependent to fight back. But she had forgotten something important. I was Thomas's wife. I had stood by him through every storm, every battle. And now, for the first time in my life, I would stand for myself. I whispered into the silence of the room, a promise to both Thomas and myself. They wanted war. Then war is what they'll get. Silence was my first weapon. I stopped answering Julia's calls. I let her leave a trail of frantic voicemails that grew shriller by the day. Each one proved what I already suspected. She wasn't calling for me, she was calling for the money I represented. Ignoring her felt like the first honest thing I'd done in weeks. Richard was my anchor. He sat in his office and walked me through ledgers and emails, pointing out the exact lines where their lies had been stitched together. "Look here," he said, tapping the screen. "Caregiver reimbursements submitted twice for the same period. Unexplained transfers to a Belize account. And here, this one's the worst. Medical bills marked paid that were never submitted to insurers." Someone was creative. His voice was a quiet, dangerous comfort. The more I dug, the angrier I felt. Not in the hot flash of a single moment, but a cold, relentless climb that hardened into resolve. Julia had siphoned money from Thomas's accounts while he was alive, and when he died she had tried to erase me with a fake will and a smile. Mark had been her whisper in the ear, pushing, jabbing, reminding her that the world owed them. They were sloppy and greedy and dead wrong about the woman they had just tried to bury. But evidence alone is a pile of stones until you build an army with them. So I began to assemble people who cared more about truth than appearances. Richard introduced me to Agent Holloway from the FBI, someone who had actually worked with Thomas on a string of confidentiality agreements. Holloway listened more than spoke. When he did, his words cut straight to the heart of the matter. Thomas had been an informant, and some of the money, legitimate through legal channels, had been moved in ways that required careful federal oversight. If Julia or Mark touched the wrong accounts, they'd tickle a hornet's nest that wouldn't sting them quietly. "That lady," Holloway told me once, "left a trail of paperwork. If anyone misused it, we can trace it." His eyes met mine. "We'll move quietly. We'll build our case. But you need to keep calm. Let them think they're safe." I learned how to play the part of the grateful widow. When Julia went into the hospital with complications, I went to the ward. I sat by her bed and smoothed the hospital blanket like the dutiful mother my image demanded. "Family first," I murmured, pressing her hand. I let her cry into my shoulder, let Mark pace the corridor and wipe his brow. In the mornings, when the nurses left the room, I recorded the conversations. Small admissions, sheepish requests for more money, suggestions that "we can't let Mom get in the way." Every sentence was saved to 2 encrypted drives and a notebook I kept in a locked drawer at Richard's office. I learned how to make pain into proof. When they asked for help with the hospital bills, I agreed, but only in writing and through formal channels. I issued checks that were traceable. I refused cash. "Let's get receipts," I said, smiling as I wrote the numbers down. The look on Mark's face when I insisted was a mix of anger and panic. He was used to easy cash, to slipping things under tapestried tables, not this new kind of scrutiny. That panic was music. My next move was subtler. I began to feed threads of information to people who could amplify consequences without revealing my hand. A discreet email to the state benefits office pointing out inconsistencies in Julia's claims. An anonymous packet, well-sourced, that triggered a preliminary review. A quiet tip to a reporter who had once covered a story about elder abuse. I attached nothing incriminating, just the smell of a story. Curiosity does the rest. At home, I made small legal maneuvers that would later tighten like a noose. Richard filed motions to put certain accounts under temporary freeze pending audit. Banks hate uncertainty. They freeze, they ask questions, and opportunists hate questions. I petitioned the court for a temporary injunction to keep the house from being sold or mortgaged while the will was authenticated. Everything was slow, bureaucratic, tedious, but that's the way to win. Paperwork favors the meticulous. When Julia announced a grand baby shower, meant to celebrate new life and soothe wounded reputations, I smiled and accepted the invitation. If they wanted an audience, I would give them one. I told my small circle, Emily, Richard, Holloway, only the pieces they needed. Emily would bring a backup flash drive to the venue. Richard would be on call for document authentication. Holloway promised to move quietly if federal issues surfaced. We planned like funeral directors. Our choreography was precise, and every step was designed to pull the curtain at the exact moment. I also let them think I'd been softened. I posted old photographs on a private account, memories of Thomas and me, of family dinners and summers on the porch. People sent hugs and sympathy. Julia commented, obligatory hearts and tear emojis, and I responded with the cool politeness of someone who has accepted condolences. Let them see the facade. People who feel powerful behind closed doors will often overreach when they think their theater continues. Between the quiet and the noise, I kept one small, private ritual. Every night, with a cup of tea at nearly midnight, I would open the binder of receipts and read them aloud, not to anyone, not even to myself as therapy, but as a litany. Grocery bills, co-pays, mortgage payments submitted by my account. Each line was proof of a life lived and a theft attempted. Saying them aloud steeled me. It turned grief into a ledger and ledger into resolve. The seeds were planted: documentation, legal maneuvers, federal attention, a media breadcrumb trail, and a personal performance of forgiveness. Now all that remained was timing, the exact moment to pull the rope and let the whole house cave in on those who'd built it on deceit. When the baby shower invitation arrived, ornate and overconfident, my pulse quickened not with fear but with anticipation. The stage was set. They had invited the town. They'd invited their friends and the very donors who admired them. They had invited an audience. And audiences make perfect witnesses. I slept little that week. But I slept smarter, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd turned pain into planning and planning into a promise. The night the unmasking began, I dressed as if I were going to church. Simple black, pearls that had belonged to Thomas. There was a sort of ritual to it for me. Put on something that declares dignity, even if your insides are a storm. I drove to the venue early, watched the valet place the cars in a neat row, listened to the muffled thrumming of a band tuning up inside. It smelled like roses and buttered canapes, and everything about it felt obscene given how the money they'd stolen had been laundered through lies and hospital bills. The first blow landed quietly, the way a predator blinds its prey before the leap. A few days earlier, Richard and I had quietly delivered copies of Julia's fraudulent welfare and caregiver reimbursement applications to the Department of Social Services. We wrapped the documents in a neat folder: dates, signatures, scanned receipts that didn't match any purchases, and bank transfers that wound through shell accounts like a bad secret. The investigator who called me afterward had a voice like gravel and a rhythm I trusted. She said the paperwork looked consistent with fraud and asked if I could testify. I said yes. I didn't say anything about the voice recorder I'd left running in the living room during more than one confession. When the gala of a baby shower began, it was a machine of glitter and light. Julia floated through her guests in a dress the color of new money, her laugh practiced and dry. Toasts were raised to new beginnings, to family unity, to overcoming hardship. People who had once offered condolences for Thomas now clinked glasses with the woman who had tried to unmake me. There's a specific kind of brazen comfort in that, when thieves begin to feel entitled in public. I had made my move earlier in the week with a local reporter whose nose for small-town corruption was the kind you either learn or are born with. I didn't call to promise a scoop. I handed him paperwork. He read, he checked, and the look on his face told me the rest. He smelled a story that would eat headlines. Halfway through Julia's contrived speech, just as she was asking the crowd to let the past be the past, he stood and raised his microphone. Cameras flashed like lightning. Questions came fast and jagged, a pelting storm. Ms. Hayes, are these allegations true? Has the Department of Social Services opened an investigation? Guests who had been laughing seconds before now fumbled for their phones, their faces draining as the reporter rattled off sums and dates. Julia's smile, which had been crafted for photographs, cracked. There is nothing more humiliating than seeing a practiced expression split to reveal panic. But the real damage was not just the cameras. I had prepared a packet, a tidy, surgical thing of invoices, email printouts, bank statements, and distributed it quietly to a handful of people whose opinions mattered: the local pastor who had hosted fundraisers, the chairman of the neighborhood association, the editor of the community paper. I wanted the story to be more than a headline. I wanted it to be a conversation at dinner tables, an entry in parish newsletters, a small scandal that would not easily be smoothed over. Then I let the social proof do its work. The third blow came when I stood, front and center, and pulled from my bag a folder I had labeled in my best neat hand: Household Expenses, 2019 to 2024. The room, which had been full of music and polite clinking, fell into a hush so thick I could hear the ice in the punch bowl. I passed the folder to the woman who had been Julia's closest friend, the one who had posted selfies with her at charity drives, and asked her to read a few lines aloud. She paid the mortgage for 3 years, the friend read, her voice catching. She paid the landscaper. She paid the emergency vet bill in 2021. The utilities. The contractor when the roof had to be fixed after the storm. The hospital co-pays. Faces registered confusion, then embarrassment, then anger. Too many people had believed the narrative Julia sold, that she was the martyr of thrift, the savior who'd kept the family afloat. The evidence showed otherwise. The golden image she'd cultivated dissolved like cheap glitter when someone put water to it. Whispers rippled first like a current, then like a tide. A woman I'd known since kindergarten clutched her napkin so hard the lace folded. A man who had lent Julia money for business ventures cleared his throat and looked very small. Mark's jaw tightened in a way that made his Adam's apple bob. He slid his arm around Julia as if touch could stitch the night back together. The twist, because fate likes its own ironies, arrived wrapped in fury. I had no idea Julia had been seeing someone else. No one did, except the man himself, who burst into the venue, breathless and wild-eyed, waving his phone like a child with a captured wasp. Screenshots spilled out of his hand, texts between Julia and Mark that were as blunt and final as a confession. "We'll tell them it was a loan," one text read. "She won't suspect until it's too late," another said. The man's voice was a rasp as he shouted that he had been betrayed, that his name and reputation had been used as cover. The room turned into a theater of unspooling lives. People who'd come for cupcakes and music now stood in clusters, mouths open, trading pieces of the story like illicit candy. Julia tried to speak. Oh, how she tried! But the words fell apart as accusations braided into each other. Mark, who'd always had an air of practiced indignation, went red and then pale as auditors in suits made notes and passers-by read the online updates that had already started. I remember the moment most clearly. Richard took my hand under the table. He squeezed, hard, in a way that said I had done my duty and that the law, which he respected like a slow-rolling engine, would now do what it does when it meets good evidence and public pressure. The investigator from the Department of Social Services arrived within 48 hours of that night. By the next morning, subpoenas were being drafted, questions were being asked, and people who had toasted to Julia's new beginnings were making hasty phone calls. By the end of the night, the baby shower, once meant to be a triumphal rebranding, had become a ruin. Julia and Mark stood not as the picture of a rejuvenated family, but as two people caught in a net woven from their own greed. Friends and acquaintances moved away like a flock of birds disturbing the water. Someone broke a champagne flute. A waiter collected it with practiced detachment, as if these social ruptures were part of the job. But I wasn't finished yet. Weeks passed, but Julia and Mark weren't the kind to accept quiet ruin. Scandal had clung to them like smoke, yet they still believed they could scrub it away with enough polish. That was when the invitations began to circulate, embossed cards with gold lettering, announcing a grand charity gala for underprivileged children. A noble cause, they declared. A fresh start. An opportunity to demonstrate resilience and generosity. The irony nearly choked me. They had stolen from their own blood, but now they wanted to buy redemption in public. I didn't stop them. No, I wanted the stage they had built, the audience they had summoned. It was the perfect place for the curtain to fall. The night of the gala glittered. The venue was one of those old ballrooms designed to impress. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, the air heavy with perfume and money. Politicians, donors, business leaders, all the people whose approval Julia and Mark worshipped, mingled over champagne flutes. Laughter rose and fell like rehearsed music. I stood outside for a long moment, watching through the glass doors, breathing steady. Inside, Julia glowed like she'd rehearsed it for weeks. She wore a gown that shimmered beneath the lights, and Mark shadowed her, shaking hands, bowing his head just enough to seem humble. They looked like royalty trying to reclaim a throne, and for a brief moment, perhaps the crowd believed them. I waited until the band finished its set and the room gathered for speeches. Julia took the stage, basking in the spotlight, her smile practiced into perfection. She spoke of giving back, of building a legacy of compassion. Her voice dripped honey, but I had the antidote ready. The lights dimmed. Murmurs rippled through the room as the projector flickered to life. For a heartbeat, confusion painted Julia's face. Then the first clip played. Julia's voice filled the ballroom, sharper, crueler than the dulcet tones she used at the podium. "She's so gullible," she laughed on screen. "We'll bleed Mom dry and she won't even notice." Gasps tore through the audience. Mark's voice followed, mocking me with that deep, smug chuckle I knew too well. "She'll hand over everything with a smile. Old people are easy marks." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the whir of the projector, the nervous rustle of dresses. Then came the wave, murmurs, sharp intakes of breath, outrage spilling from the crowd. People shifted in their seats, eyes wide, faces twisting between disbelief and fury. Julia lunged for the microphone. "These recordings are fake, doctored. Someone's trying to sabotage us." Her words cracked under the weight of panic. Mark tried to roar over her, blaming her for the scheme, insisting he had been tricked, that it was all Julia's doing. But the evidence rolled on, clip after clip, date stamped, their voices dripping venom. In one, Julia bragged about forging documents. In another, Mark laughed about offshore accounts and tax idiots too lazy to dig deep. The donors didn't wait for the show to end. Chairs scraped the floor as people stood and stormed out, shaking their heads, their donations slipping back into purses and pockets. The press, who had been invited to cover the gala as a human interest story, turned their cameras on the chaos. Flashes lit the room like lightning. I stepped forward then. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady, calm. For the first time in months, I was not trembling, not hiding, not afraid. I met Julia's frantic eyes, then Mark's, and spoke with the quiet authority of truth. Now the world knows who you really are. The words landed heavier than any shout. Julia froze, her mouth half open, eyes darting as though searching for a script she no longer had. Mark's face collapsed into fury, veins rising on his neck. But it was useless. The performance was over. The crowd no longer looked at them as hosts or benefactors, but as swindlers, frauds, parasites. The polished mask had shattered, and behind it stood only greed and cruelty. Security arrived to maintain order, but they didn't need to touch me. I walked out on my own terms, shoulders square, back unbent, the night air cool and clean against my skin. Behind me, I could hear the gala unravel, shouts, reporters barking questions, Julia's sobs mingling with Mark's curses. For months I had lived in their shadow, swallowing betrayal like poison. But in that moment I was free. Free of fear. Free of the illusion that blood always means loyalty. Free to finally step into the light with my head held high. That was the moment justice struck. It didn't come with gavel or jail cell, not yet. It came with truth, with exposure, with the collapse of their carefully built lies. It came with the sound of doors closing on them, one after another, while the world opened for me again. And as I walked away from the wreckage, I knew their empire was finished, and my vengeance was complete. Julia and Mark's empire crumbled faster than anyone imagined. The morning after the gala, headlines screamed their names. Local couple caught in fraud scandal. Charity gala turns into public meltdown. Reporters dissected the recordings I had played, word by damning word. Social media caught fire. Clips of Julia sneering about bleeding mom dry circulated everywhere. Overnight, they became infamous. The IRS came knocking first. Mark had always been sloppy with his offshore accounts, too confident in his ability to stay 2 steps ahead of the government. Auditors swarmed in, digging into every shell company, every suspicious wire transfer. Fines became seizures. Seizures became indictments. By the end of the month, Mark was meeting with lawyers instead of donors. Julia's fall was quieter but no less brutal. Fraud charges piled up, caregiver reimbursements, forged applications, misused funds. Her friends, who once clung to her at charity luncheons, stopped answering her calls. Invitations dried up. By spring, she wasn't hosting dinners, she was begging for them. The social circle she and Mark had polished like a crown jewel evaporated overnight, leaving her isolated in the very community she had once ruled. And me. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I chose peace. For months, I had lived with vengeance as my compass. Now that justice had been served, I needed something else to guide me. I thought of Thomas, steady, generous Thomas, and asked myself what he would have wanted me to do with the ashes of this ordeal. The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. I would build something good. Something that mattered. That was how the Hayes Foundation for Elder Protection was born. With Richard's help, I poured my energy and resources into creating a non-profit dedicated to helping seniors escape abuse, exploitation, and financial manipulation. I knew too well how vulnerable the elderly could be, how easily trust could be weaponized. If my story could prevent even one widow from being stripped of her dignity, then all the pain I endured would have meaning. Within a year, the foundation grew beyond anything I had imagined. We hosted workshops teaching seniors how to recognize scams. We partnered with social workers and law enforcement to create rapid response teams for victims of abuse. Survivors began sharing their stories, sometimes in tears, sometimes in shaky laughter. And every time someone said, "I thought I was alone until I found you," I felt Thomas's presence like a hand on my shoulder. In building the foundation, I also rebuilt myself. For decades, my identity had been tethered to others. I was Thomas's wife, the loyal companion. I was Julia's mother, the doting provider. Those roles defined me so thoroughly that when they crumbled, I didn't know who Eleanor was. But in the quiet hours, writing grant applications, speaking at events, listening to other survivors, I began to recognize her. Eleanor wasn't just someone's wife or mother. She was a woman who had endured betrayal, carved justice from it, and dared to begin again. Emily became my chosen family. She had been there through every storm, every tear, every sleepless night. We laughed more often now, sometimes about the past, sometimes about nothing at all. She reminded me that love doesn't